The first time I saw the eyes, I convinced myself it was a deer. That's what you do when your mind encounters something it cannot process. You rationalize, you explain away, you tell yourself the massive shape standing motionless between the Douglas firs at the edge of your property is just wildlife, just shadows, just your imagination working overtime after too many late nights and too much black coffee. That was 8 years ago. I was 43 then, recently divorced, and I had just purchased a cabin in the remote mountains of Northern California, about 60 miles northeast of Redding, in a stretch of wilderness so isolated that my nearest neighbor lived 11 miles down a logging road that hadn't been maintained since 1987. The cabin had belonged to an elderly woman named Edith Crawley, who had lived there alone for 32 years before passing away in her sleep the previous winter. Her nephew sold me the property for $68,000, which was probably $40,000 less than it was worth. But he lived in Phoenix and wanted nothing to do with a place that required a four-wheel drive vehicle just to reach the mailbox. I was a software engineer who had spent 21 years writing code for a company in San Jose, staring at screens until my eyes burned and my soul felt like it was slowly dissolving into the fluorescent lighting of an open-plan office. The divorce had been my wake-up call. Jennifer had looked at me across the kitchen table of our 3-bedroom house in Sunnyvale and told me she didn't recognize me anymore, that somewhere in the previous decade, I had become a ghost who paid the mortgage but wasn't really present for anything else. She wasn't wrong. I had automated myself into invisibility, become an algorithm that performed the functions of a husband without actually being one. So I bought the cabin. I told my employer I was taking early retirement, cashed out my stock options, and drove north in my Toyota Tacoma with everything I owned packed into the bed. It took me 7 hours to reach the property, the last 90 minutes spent navigating a road that was more pothole than pavement. And when I finally pulled up to the cabin as the September sun was setting behind the mountains, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The cabin was small, maybe 800 square feet, with a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a single bedroom and a bathroom with plumbing that worked most of the time when the temperatures stayed above freezing. There was a wood-burning stove for heat, a generator for electricity when I needed it, and a solar panel system that Edith's nephew had installed 3 years before she died, which provided enough power for basic lighting and to charge my laptop. The nearest cell tower was 23 miles away, which meant I had no phone signal at the cabin. I bought a satellite phone for emergencies, but for everyday communication, I had to drive to a small town called Pine Creek, population 312, where the general store had Wi-Fi and a landline I could use for $0.25 a minute. I loved it. For the first time in 2 decades, I could hear myself think. I could spend hours sitting on the porch watching hawks circle overhead, listening to the wind move through the ponderosa pines, feeling like a human being instead of a cog in someone else's machine. I started writing, something I had always wanted to do but never had time for. I read books, real physical books that I ordered online and had delivered to a post office box in Pine Creek. I learned to identify birds by their calls, to track deer through the forest, to predict weather changes by the smell of the air and the behavior of the squirrels. And every night, without fail, I built a fire in the stove, poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, and sat in the rocking chair by the window that looked out toward the tree line at the eastern edge of my property, about 70 yards from the cabin. That tree line became my meditation, my focus point, the boundary between my new life and the vast wilderness that stretched for hundreds of miles into the Cascade Range. It was during one of those evening vigils, about 3 weeks after I moved in, that I first saw the eyes. The moon was nearly full that night, bright enough to cast shadows, and I was watching the tree line the way I always did. Not looking for anything in particular, just letting my gaze rest on the darkness between the trees. That's when I noticed something different. 2 points of light reflecting the moonlight, positioned maybe 7 feet off the ground. Too high to be a deer, too far apart to be a mountain lion. They were perfectly still, and they were pointed directly at the cabin, directly at me. My first instinct was fear, that primal response that lives in the oldest part of our brains, the part that remembers when we were prey. My hand tightened on my bourbon glass. My breath caught in my throat. Every muscle in my body tensed, preparing for flight or fight, though I had no idea what I would be fleeing from or fighting against. Then the eyes blinked. It was a slow, deliberate blink, and when they opened again, they were still there, still watching. I sat frozen in my rocking chair for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then, without any sound I could detect, the eyes simply disappeared. One moment they were there, twin points of reflected light in the darkness, and the next moment they were gone, as if whatever owned them had simply melted into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window until dawn, the bourbon untouched beside me, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. When the sun finally rose, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold, I walked out to the spot where I had seen the eyes. The ground was soft from recent rain, and what I found there made my hands shake. Footprints, massive footprints, easily 17 inches long and 7 inches wide, pressed deep into the soft earth. They were shaped like human feet with 5 distinct toes, but the size was impossible. No human could have feet that large. The stride length between prints was nearly 5 feet, suggesting something with legs much longer than mine. I followed the tracks into the forest, but they disappeared after about 30 yards, either because the ground became harder or because whatever made them had started walking on rocks and fallen logs to avoid leaving a trail. I stood there in the morning light, my heart pounding, my rational mind fighting a losing battle against what my eyes were telling me. I had grown up hearing stories about Bigfoot, about Sasquatch, about the creatures that supposedly lived in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. I had always dismissed them as folklore, as hoaxes, as the wishful thinking of people who wanted to believe in something mysterious. But now I was staring at evidence that suggested those stories might have a grain of truth. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. Who would I tell? I had no close friends anymore, no family who would understand. And what would I say? That I had seen eyes in the darkness and found giant footprints in my yard? They would think I had lost my mind, that the isolation had finally gotten to me. So I kept it to myself. But I started watching more carefully. Every night I sat by that window, my eyes scanning the tree line, waiting to see if the eyes would return. They did. 3 nights later, around 11:30 in the evening, the same twin points of light appeared in the same spot between the Douglas firs. This time, I was ready. I had a pair of binoculars beside me, and I raised them slowly, carefully, trying not to make any sudden movements that might startle whatever was watching me. Through the binoculars, I could see more detail, but not much. The eyes were set in a face that was darker than the surrounding forest, covered in what looked like dark brown or black hair. The brow was heavy, protruding, giving the eyes a deep-set appearance. I couldn't make out a nose or mouth, just that massive hair-covered face with those intelligent eyes fixed on my cabin. We watched each other for perhaps 10 minutes. Then, just like before, the creature simply disappeared, fading into the forest without a sound. I went out the next morning and found fresh tracks in the same location, confirming that I hadn't imagined it, that something real and physical had been standing there observing me. This became our pattern. every few nights, sometimes 3 nights in a row. Sometimes with a week between sightings, the creature would appear at the tree line. It never came closer than 70 yards. It never made any sound I could hear. It simply stood there in the darkness, watching, and then it would leave. I started keeping a journal documenting each sighting with the date, time, weather, conditions, and any details I could observe. Over the first year, I recorded 47 separate appearances. By the end of that first year, the fear had faded. I had come to expect the eyes, to almost look forward to them. There was something comforting about the ritual, something that made me feel less alone in my isolation. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't threatening me. It wasn't approaching the cabin. It wasn't exhibiting any aggressive behavior. It was simply watching, observing, keeping tabs on the strange human who had moved into territory that had probably been its home long before Edith Crawley built her cabin. I started leaving food at the edge of the tree line. Nothing elaborate, just apples and vegetables from my trips to Pine Creek. Sometimes fish I caught from the stream that ran through the southern edge of my property. I would place the offerings on a flat rock about 20 yards into the forest and then retreat to the cabin. By morning, the food was always gone. I never saw the creature take it, never found any evidence of what happened to it, but it was always gone. In the spring of my second year at the cabin, something changed. I was sitting on my porch in the late afternoon, reading a paperback western I had picked up in town, when I heard a sound from the forest. It was a vocalization unlike anything I had ever heard, a low, resonant call that seemed to vibrate in my chest, somewhere between a howl and a groan. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, and then the forest went completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just that eerie, complete silence that descends when something large and important is present. I set down my book and looked toward the tree line. The sun was still up, casting long shadows across the meadow between the cabin and the forest. And there, standing at the edge of the trees in full daylight, was the creature I had been watching for more than a year. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, probably closer to 8.5, with shoulders that must have been 4 feet across. The body was covered in dark brown hair, longer around the shoulders and head, shorter on the arms and chest. The arms were long, hanging past what would have been the knees on a human, ending in hands that looked surprisingly human-like despite their enormous size. The legs were thick, powerfully muscled, bent slightly at the knee, in a posture that suggested it could move with explosive speed if it chose to. But it was the face that held my attention. In the failing light, I could see it clearly for the first time. The features were ape-like in some ways, with that heavy brow ridge and broad, flat nose, but there was something else there too, something almost human in the shape of the jaw, the placement of the eyes, the way the face seemed capable of expression. The eyes themselves were dark brown, deep-set, and they held an intelligence that was unmistakable. This was not the blank stare of an animal. This was the gaze of a thinking, reasoning being. We looked at each other for perhaps 30 seconds. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I forced myself to remain still, to not make any sudden movements. Then the creature did something that changed everything. It raised one massive hand and made a gesture that was clearly deliberate. It touched its chest, then extended its hand toward me, palm up. The meaning was unmistakable. It was introducing itself. It was acknowledging our connection. I don't know what possessed me to do what I did next. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been my constant companion since the divorce. Maybe it was simply the recognition of one isolated soul reaching out to another. But I stood up slowly, placed my hand on my own chest, and extended it toward the creature in the same gesture it had shown me. The creature watched for a moment, then it made that sound again, that low, resonant vocalization, but softer this time, almost gentle. And then it turned and disappeared into the forest. I sat back down in my chair, my legs shaking so badly I wasn't sure they would hold me. I had just communicated with something that science said didn't exist. I had exchanged greetings with a Bigfoot. And somehow, impossibly, I knew that our relationship had just entered a new phase. The months that followed were a gradual process of trust building, a delicate dance between two very different creatures trying to understand each other. The sightings continued, but they became longer, more interactive. The creature would appear at the tree line, and instead of simply watching and disappearing, it would sometimes stay for an hour or more. I would sit on my porch, and it would stand in the shadows, and we would observe each other, learning, communicating in ways that transcended language. I started talking to it. Not because I expected it to understand English, but because the sound of my voice seemed to put it at ease. I would describe my day, tell it about the book I was reading, share random thoughts about life and loneliness and the strange path that had brought me to this cabin in the wilderness. The creature would listen, its head occasionally tilting in that way that suggested attention, that universal gesture of a thinking being processing information. It responded with its own vocalizations. Over time, I began to recognize different sounds and associate them with different meanings. There was a low rumble that seemed to indicate contentment or agreement, a higher-pitched call that appeared when it was alert or concerned, and a series of clicking sounds that I eventually realized were a form of laughter. The creature had a sense of humor. It would sometimes mimic my gestures or postures in ways that seemed deliberately exaggerated, and then make those clicking sounds, clearly amused by its own joke. By my third year at the cabin, we had established something I can only describe as a friendship. The creature never came closer than about 40 yards during the day, but at night, when I sat by my window with the lamp off and only the wood stove providing light, it would sometimes approach to within 20 yards of the cabin, close enough that I could see details I had missed before. The graying hair around its muzzle that suggested age, the scar on its left shoulder that told a story of some past injury, the way it favored its right leg slightly when it walked, perhaps from the same incident that had caused the scar. I named it Sentinel, not out loud, not to its face, just in my own mind and in my journal. It seemed fitting. This creature had made my cabin part of its territory, had appointed itself as a watcher, a guardian of this small piece of wilderness. Whether it was protecting me or simply observing a curiosity, I couldn't say, but the name felt right. I learned things about Sentinel through observation. It was primarily nocturnal, appearing most often between 10 at night and 2 in the morning. It was an omnivore, judging by the foods it would take and leave. Fruits and vegetables disappeared readily, but it also took the fish I left, and once I found evidence that it had killed and eaten a deer near the edge of my property. It was territorial, marking the boundaries of its range with scent markers that I could sometimes detect, a musky, earthy smell that was unpleasant but not overwhelming. I also learned that Sentinel was probably alone. In 3 years of observation, I never saw another creature of its kind, never heard another call being answered, never found tracks that suggested a second individual. This realization made me profoundly sad. Whatever Sentinel was, wherever its kind came from, it appeared to be solitary, perhaps the last of its tribe in this particular stretch of mountains. We were alike in that way. Two isolated beings finding connection in the most unlikely of circumstances. The 4th year brought changes. That winter was particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping to 15 below zero and snow accumulating to depths of 4 feet in some places. For nearly 2 months, I saw no sign of Sentinel. The tracks disappeared, the night visits stopped, and I found myself worried in a way that surprised me. Had the creature died? Had it migrated to lower elevations where the winter was less severe? Had something happened to drive it away? The relief I felt when spring arrived and Sentinel reappeared at the tree line was overwhelming. The creature looked thinner than I remembered, its movements slower, and I realized it had probably struggled through the harsh winter just as I had. I doubled the amount of food I left at the edge of the forest, and over the following months, I watched Sentinel gradually regain its strength and vitality. That summer, something else happened. I had a visitor. The sound of an engine coming up the logging road was so unusual that I actually grabbed the shotgun I kept for emergencies before going to investigate. The vehicle was an old Ford pickup, rust-eaten and mud-splattered, driven by a man in his 70s with a full white beard and the weathered skin of someone who had spent his life outdoors. He introduced himself as Walter Gunderson, and he explained that he had been a friend of Edith Crawley. Walter and I sat on my porch drinking coffee while he told me about the cabin's history. He had helped Edith's husband Jacob build it back in 1962, had watched Edith live here alone after Jacob died in 1974, had checked on her every few months until her own death. He was pleased to see that someone was taking care of the place, he said, but there was something else behind his eyes, something he wasn't saying. Finally, as the afternoon shadows grew long, Walter set down his coffee cup and looked at me with an expression that was part sympathy and part curiosity. "You've seen it, haven't you?" "The thing in the woods." I didn't answer immediately. I hadn't told anyone about Sentinel, hadn't even hinted at what I had experienced over the past 4 years. But something in Walter's tone, in the matter-of-fact way he asked the question, made me think he already knew. "I've seen something," I admitted. "I don't know what to call it." Walter nodded slowly. "Edith saw it too. For 32 years, she watched it watching her. She used to leave food for it, same as I suspect you do. She called it her forest friend, said it made her feel safe, like nothing bad could happen as long as it was keeping watch." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Did she ever try to tell anyone?" "Once. Told me about it in 1981, maybe 82. I thought she was losing her mind, to be honest. Too many years alone in the woods. But she showed me the tracks, showed me where she left the food, and one night she showed me those eyes in the darkness." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the tree line. "I never saw it clear, not like she described, but I saw enough to know she wasn't crazy. We talked for another hour. Walter told me that Edith had kept her own journal, documenting her encounters with the creature over 3 decades. He didn't know what had happened to that journal after she died, but he suspected it might still be somewhere in the cabin, hidden away like so many things Edith had kept private. After Walter left, I searched the cabin with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. I checked every drawer, every cabinet, every loose floorboard. It took me 2 days, but I finally found it, a leather-bound notebook hidden in a space beneath the wood stove's hearthstone, wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture and heat. Edith's journal was a revelation. Her handwriting was small and precise, and she had documented her encounters with the creature. She called it simply the Watcher, with scientific rigor, dates, times, weather conditions, behavioral observations. According to her records, she had first seen the creature in 1963, just a year after moving to the cabin. For 31 years, she had maintained a relationship with it that paralleled my own, based on mutual observation, gradual trust building, and a deep respect for the boundary between human and wild. But Edith's journal contained something else, something that made my blood run cold when I read it. In an entry dated March 15, 1992, Edith had written about a night when everything changed. She had been sitting by her window as she did every evening when the Watcher approached the cabin, not to the tree line, not to the middle of the meadow, all the way to the cabin, stopping just outside her window. And then it had knocked. 3 deliberate knocks on the wooden frame of the window, just like a person would knock on a door. Edith had been terrified, she admitted, in the journal. In 30 years, the Watcher had never approached so close, had never initiated direct contact in such a human way. She had sat frozen in her chair, too afraid to move, until the creature had simply turned and walked back into the forest. "It never came that close again," she wrote. "But sometimes I wonder what it wanted, what it would have said if I had opened that window and acknowledged it." I sat with that journal entry for a long time, thinking about what it meant. Edith had experienced something different from our gradual, distant friendship. The creature had reached out to her in a way that went beyond observation, beyond the passive interaction we had established. It had knocked like someone seeking entry, like someone with something to say. I wondered if it would ever do the same to me. Years 5, 6, and 7 at the cabin passed with a rhythm that had become familiar. Sentinel continued its nightly visits, our wordless communication growing more nuanced and comfortable over time. I learned to read its body language, to understand when it was relaxed and when something had put it on alert. It learned my routines, knew when I would be on the porch, seemed almost to anticipate when I would leave food at the usual spot. There were developments I hadn't expected. In my 6th year, I found evidence that Sentinel had left things for me, not just taking the food I offered, but reciprocating with gifts of its own. A perfectly round stone, smooth as glass, left on the flat rock where I placed the apples. A handful of wild berries arranged in a small pile near my porch steps. Once, what appeared to be a bird's nest, intricately woven, placed at the edge of the meadow where I would be sure to find it. I kept these gifts in a wooden box I had built specifically for that purpose. Each one felt precious, evidence of a connection that transcended species, proof that whatever Sentinel was, it understood the concept of exchange, of giving and receiving, of relationship. My health deteriorated somewhat during these years. I was in my late 40s now, and the physical demands of living off-grid were taking their toll. My knees ached from hauling wood. My back protested after long days of property maintenance. I developed a persistent cough during the winters that never quite went away during the summers, but I couldn't imagine leaving. This cabin, this forest, this strange friendship with a creature that shouldn't exist, these things had become my life. I would rather die here than return to the world I had left behind. And then came year 8. The summer of my 8th year at the cabin was unusually hot and dry. Fire warnings were constant, and I spent much of my time clearing brush and creating defensible space around the cabin. Sentinel seemed agitated during this period, appearing more frequently but staying for shorter times, pacing along the tree line instead of standing still. I wondered if the creature sensed the danger, if some instinct warned it that the forest was vulnerable, that disaster could come at any moment. The fire started on August 19th, about 15 miles south of my property. I saw the smoke first, a dark column rising against the blue sky, and I knew immediately what it meant. Within hours, the air had turned hazy, the sun becoming a red disk that cast everything in an apocalyptic orange glow. I packed my truck with essential supplies ready to evacuate if necessary, but the wind was blowing the fire away from my property, and the authorities said I should be safe as long as conditions didn't change. That night, I didn't see Sentinel at all. I sat by my window, watching the glow of distant flames on the southern horizon, wondering if the creature had fled to safer territory, if our 8-year relationship was about to end because of forces beyond either of our control. The fire burned for 2 weeks before it was finally contained. 12,000 acres of forest reduced to ash, including areas I knew Sentinel frequented. When the smoke finally cleared and I could safely venture beyond my property, I walked through a landscape that looked like the surface of another planet. Blackened trees, still smoldering stumps, the occasional carcass of a deer or raccoon that hadn't escaped in time. I searched for signs of Sentinel for days. No tracks, no scent markers, no response when I made the low humming sound I had learned to use as a greeting. For the first time since arriving at the cabin, I felt truly alone. 3 weeks after the fire was contained, I was sitting on my porch at twilight, my bourbon untouched beside me, staring at the charred tree line where the fire had stopped just 200 yards from my property. The forest that had been my boundary was now a graveyard of standing dead trees, blackened skeletons against the pink and orange sky. That's when I heard it, that low, resonant vocalization I hadn't heard in nearly a month, coming from somewhere in the burned forest, distant but unmistakable. I stood up so fast I knocked over my glass. My eyes scanned the black landscape, searching for any sign of movement. And then I saw it, a massive shape emerging from behind a cluster of burned trees, moving toward me with a determination I had never seen before. Sentinel had survived. The creature stopped at the edge of my property, where the green grass of my cleared meadow met the black ash of the burned forest. It looked different somehow. The fur on its left side was patchy and singed. One arm hung at an angle that suggested injury, but those eyes, those intelligent, ancient eyes, were fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then Sentinel did something it had never done in 8 years of observation. It began to walk toward the cabin, not stopping at the tree line, not pausing in the middle of the meadow, just walking slowly, deliberately, across the open ground toward me. I should have been afraid. Some part of me knew that this massive, powerful creature could kill me without effort if it chose to. But I felt no fear. I felt only a profound sense of anticipation, as if everything that had happened over the past 8 years had been building toward this single moment. Sentinel stopped about 10 feet from my porch. This close, I could see the full extent of the fire damage, the singed fur, the burn on its left arm that had left the skin raw and weeping, the exhaustion in its posture, the way it held itself like someone who had been through an ordeal and was barely standing. It looked at me, and I looked at it, and in that silence, something passed between us that I will never be able to fully explain. Recognition, acknowledgement, a bond that had been formed over 8 years of patient, distant observation, finally reaching its culmination. And then Sentinel spoke, not in words, not in any language I recognized, but in a voice that was unmistakably attempting human speech. The sounds were rough, guttural, like someone speaking through a throat that wasn't designed for language. But the meaning was clear. Help. I don't know how I managed to respond. My mouth had gone completely dry. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my legs felt like they might give way at any moment. But somehow I found my voice. "I'll help you," I said. "I'll help you." Sentinel made that low rumble I had come to associate with agreement or contentment. Then it sat down on the ground, right there in my front yard, and for the first time in 8 years, I found myself close enough to touch a creature that had watched over my cabin since before I arrived. I went inside and gathered everything I could think of. Water in a large basin, clean cloth for bandages, the antibiotic ointment I kept in my first aid kit. I had no idea if human medicine would work on whatever Sentinel was, but I had to try. This creature that had been my silent companion for 8 years was injured and suffering, and it had come to me for help. The next hour was the most surreal experience of my life. I cleaned the burns on Sentinel's arm while it sat perfectly still, those intelligent eyes watching my every movement. The skin beneath the fur was dark, almost gray, and the texture was leathery, tougher than human skin. The burn was severe, but not as deep as I had feared. The creature made soft sounds as I worked, not cries of pain exactly, but vocalizations that suggested it was enduring something unpleasant. When I finished, Sentinel looked at its bandaged arm, then at me. It made a sound I had never heard before, something between a sigh and a word. and I somehow understood that it was expressing gratitude. "You're welcome," I said, not knowing what else to say. "Stay here tonight. Rest." Sentinel considered this for a long moment. Then it moved, not back toward the forest, but toward the side of my cabin. It settled itself against the wall, its massive back leaning against the wooden planks, its injured arm cradled against its chest. Within minutes, its breathing had deepened into what I could only assume was sleep. I sat on my porch all that night, watching over a sleeping Bigfoot like some kind of ridiculous guardian angel. I should have been terrified. I should have been questioning my sanity, but all I felt was a profound sense of rightness, as if everything in my life had led to this moment, to this strange and beautiful connection between a lonely human and a lonely creature of the forest. The sun rose on a scene that shouldn't have been possible. A Bigfoot sleeping against my cabin wall, a 51-year-old divorced software engineer sitting nearby with an empty bourbon glass. And between us, something that transcended species, that defied explanation, that simply was. Sentinel slept through most of that first day. I brought water, which it drank carefully from a large plastic basin I had set nearby. I brought food, apples and fish, and some leftover venison stew I had made the day before, and watched as the creature ate with a delicacy that seemed at odds with its massive size. I changed the bandages on its arm, noting with relief that the burn already looked less angry, less inflamed. By evening, Sentinel was stronger. It stood stretching in a way that was startlingly human and looked toward the burned forest that had been its home. The devastation stretched as far as we could see, a black wasteland where living forest had stood just weeks before. Sentinel made a sound, that mournful vocalization I had heard before, but deeper now, more resonant. I understood without being told that this was grief, that the creature was mourning the loss of its territory, its home, everything familiar. "You can stay here," I said, not knowing if it would understand. "You're welcome here, for as long as you need." The creature turned to look at me. Those eyes, those ancient, intelligent eyes held something that might have been hope. Then it made that low rumble of agreement and settled back against my cabin wall. That was 3 months ago. Since then, Sentinel has not returned to what remains of the forest. It stays near the cabin, sometimes sleeping against the wall, sometimes sitting in the meadow watching the stars, sometimes simply being present in a way that transforms my isolation into something else entirely. We have developed a new routine. I talk to Sentinel about everything. My past life, my regrets, my hopes, the books I read, the thoughts that keep me awake at night. The creature listens with that attentive tilt of its head, and sometimes it responds with vocalizations that I am slowly learning to understand. Not language exactly, but something close to it, a system of sounds and gestures that conveys meaning in ways that words sometimes cannot. Sentinel has tried to speak to me several times since that first night. The attempts are halting, difficult, the sounds emerging from a throat that was not evolved for human speech. But I have understood individual words now, fragments of communication that suggest the creature has been listening to humans, learning, waiting for the right moment to bridge the gap between our worlds. "Home," it said one night, gesturing toward the burned forest. "Gone," I replied, and Sentinel made that sound of grief. "Here," I said, gesturing to the cabin. "This is your home now." The creature looked at me for a long time. Then it reached out one massive hand and touched my shoulder, gently, carefully, with a tenderness that seemed impossible for something so large and powerful. "Friend," it said, the word rough and broken but unmistakable. "Friend," I agreed. Last night, everything changed again. I was sitting by my window as usual, the lamp turned low, the wood stove crackling softly behind me. Sentinel was outside, visible in the moonlight, sitting in its usual spot against the cabin wall. I had grown accustomed to its presence, comforted by knowing it was there, keeping watch as it had done for 8 years, but now from close proximity instead of from the distant tree line. Around midnight, Sentinel stood up. This in itself was not unusual, as the creature often moved around during the night, stretching, walking the perimeter of my property, disappearing for hours before returning. But something in its posture was different. There was a tension in its massive shoulders, a deliberateness in its movements that I had not seen before. It walked to the front of the cabin, not to the side where it usually rested, to the front, to my door. And then Sentinel did what Edith had described in her journal, what she had experienced 32 years ago, what I had wondered about ever since reading those faded words. It knocked. 3 deliberate knocks on my door, just like a person would knock, heavy enough to shake the frame. I sat frozen in my chair, my heart pounding, my mind racing. 8 years of watching, 8 years of gradual trust, 8 years building toward this moment. I stood up, I walked to the door, and with a hand that was trembling but determined, I opened it. Sentinel stood there in the moonlight, massive and impossible, its dark eyes looking down at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not cautious, not wary, something else, something that looked almost like hope. The creature raised one hand and touched its chest. Then it extended that hand toward me, palm up, the same gesture of greeting it had shown me 4 years ago. And then it spoke, not in fragments, not in broken attempts at human words, but in a full sentence that emerged rough and slow, but unmistakably clear. "I have something to tell you," it said, "something you need to know." I stepped aside and gestured into my cabin. "Come in," I said. "Tell me everything." Sentinel ducked through the doorway, its massive frame filling my small living space. And as it settled onto the floor by my wood stove, I knew that whatever came next would change everything I thought I understood about the world, about these creatures, about the 8 years I had spent watching and being watched. The fire crackled. The wind moved through what remained of the forest outside, and a creature that shouldn't exist began to tell me a story that no human had ever heard. Sentinel's voice filled my small cabin like thunder contained in a bottle. The words came slowly, each one a struggle against anatomy that had never been designed for human speech. But the meaning was unmistakable. The creature spoke of things I had never imagined, of a history that predated everything I thought I knew about these mountains, about this land, about the relationship between humans and the beings who had lived here long before us. "My people," Sentinel began, "have watched yours for longer than your kind can remember. We were here when the first humans crossed the land bridge from the north. We watched them spread across this continent. We learned their languages, their customs, their ways. And we made a choice. We chose to remain hidden." I sat in my rocking chair, unable to move, barely able to breathe. The fire crackled in the wood stove. Outside, the wind moved through the dead trees of the burned forest. And inside my cabin, a creature that shouldn't exist was telling me the secret history of its kind. "Once," Sentinel continued, "there were many of us, thousands spread across these mountains from what you call Alaska to what you call Mexico. We had territories, families, traditions passed down through generations beyond counting. We were not primitive, we were not animals. We were a people, different from yours, but no less aware, no less capable of thought and feeling and memory." The creature paused, those dark eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the stove. When it spoke again, there was something in its voice that I recognized. Grief. The same grief I had heard when it looked at the burned forest. The same grief I had felt when Jennifer told me she didn't recognize me anymore. "Your people changed everything. Not through malice, not at first, simply through expansion. You spread across the land like water finding, its level filling every valley, every forest, every mountain, and we retreated. Year by year, generation by generation, we moved deeper into the wilderness, into the places you had not yet reached. We became shadows. We became legends. We became the stories your children tell around campfires, half believed, never proven. I found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Why didn't you make contact? Why didn't you try to communicate with us? Sentinel made a sound that I had learned to recognize as bitter amusement. We did. Many times in the early years, before your people had spread so far, before you had become so numerous, some of us tried to build bridges between our kinds. There were places where we traded with human tribes, where we lived alongside them in mutual respect. The creature's massive hand gestured toward the darkness outside my window. But your people are not one tribe. You are many tribes, many nations, many ways of thinking. What one group accepted, another group feared. What one village welcomed, another village hunted. We learned that trust given to one human did not transfer to another. We learned that the safest human was one who did not know we existed at all. I thought about what Sentinel was telling me, about the implications of a parallel civilization hiding in the shadows of our own, watching us, learning from us, fearing us. It was almost too much to comprehend. How many of you are left? I asked. Sentinel was quiet for a long moment. When it spoke, the grief in its voice was almost unbearable. When I was young, perhaps 80 winters ago, there were still hundreds of us in these mountains alone. Now, in all the land from the great northern forests to the southern deserts, perhaps 200 remain. We do not gather often. We do not risk being seen together. But we know of each other. We pass messages through the old ways, through calls that carry across valleys, through signs left on trees and stones. And each year, the messages grow fewer. Each year, another territory falls silent. 200. In all of North America, only 200 of these magnificent, intelligent beings remained. The number hit me like a physical blow. Why are you telling me this? I asked. After 8 years of watching, after all this time keeping your distance, why reveal yourself now? Sentinel looked at me, and in those ancient eyes I saw something I hadn't expected. Desperation. Because I am old, it said. Because my territory is burned, my food sources destroyed, my ability to survive alone growing weaker with each passing season. Because I have watched you for 8 years and seen something in you that gives me hope. Because Edith saw it too, though she was too afraid to answer when I knocked on her window all those years ago. Because I have tried to tell humans before what I am about to tell you, and they either fled in terror or tried to capture me for profit. But you were different. You have been different from the first night you saw my eyes in the darkness. The creature leaned forward and I could feel the heat radiating from its massive body, could smell that musky, earthy scent that I had come to associate with its presence. I am the last of my family line, Sentinel said. My parents died when I was still young, killed by hunters who came into our territory looking for trophies. My siblings scattered to distant territories and were lost to disease or accidents or the slow starvation that comes when there is not enough land left to sustain us. I have no mate. I have no offspring. When I die, everything my line has learned, everything we have remembered for countless generations, dies with me. The weight of those words settled over me like a physical burden. This creature, this ancient being that had watched over my cabin for 8 years, was facing extinction not just as an individual, but as a carrier of irreplaceable knowledge and memory. What can I do? I asked, and I meant it with everything I had. How can I help? Sentinel reached into a pouch I hadn't noticed before, a simple container made of woven bark that hung from a cord around its massive chest. From it, the creature withdrew something that made my breath catch. It was a stone, flat and smooth, about the size of my palm, and carved into its surface were symbols I didn't recognize, patterns that seemed to shift and dance in the firelight. "This is a memory stone," Sentinel explained. "My people have used them for generations, beyond counting, to preserve our history, our knowledge, our stories. Each symbol represents not just a word, but a concept, a memory, an entire chapter of experience. This stone contains everything I know about the old ways, about the territories that once belonged to my people, about the medicines we discovered, and the seasons we learned to read, and the paths through these mountains that no human has ever walked." The creature held the stone out toward me, and I understood what it was offering. Not just an artifact, but a legacy. The accumulated wisdom of a dying species entrusted to a lonely human in a remote cabin. "I cannot read this," I said, my voice barely audible. "No, but you can protect it. You can ensure that when my kind is finally gone, something of us remains. And perhaps someday there will be humans wise enough to decipher what we have preserved, to learn from our mistakes and our triumphs, to understand that you are not alone on this earth and never have been." I reached out and took the stone from Sentinel's massive hand. It was warm, whether from the creature's body heat or from some energy of its own, I couldn't tell. The symbols seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of my cabin, ancient knowledge waiting to be unlocked. "There is more," Sentinel said. And now its voice carried something else, something that sounded almost like hope. "There are others like you, not many, but some. Humans who have seen us, who have kept our secret, who have chosen to help rather than exploit. They are scattered across this land, hidden like we are hidden, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Some of them have memory stones of their own. Some of them have been guardians of our knowledge for generations, passing the responsibility from parent to child like a sacred trust." Sentinel paused, and I saw something in its eyes that I had never seen before. A light, a spark of something that defied the grief and despair that had dominated our conversation. "We have been watching, we have been waiting. And now, after centuries of hiding, after generations of decline, we believe the time may be coming when hiding is no longer possible. Your technology grows more powerful each year. Your cameras see further. Your machines hear more clearly. Your satellites watch from above. Soon, very soon, there will be nowhere left for us to hide." The creature's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "When that day comes, we want there to be humans who understand us, who can speak for us, who can tell the world that we are not monsters, not animals, not threats to be eliminated. We want there to be guardians who can help our two peoples find a way to coexist, as we should have done long ago." I understood then why Sentinel had knocked on my door, why it had chosen this moment to reveal itself, why it had trusted me with the memory stone. This wasn't just about one lonely creature seeking help from one lonely human. This was about the future of two species, about building bridges that should have been built centuries ago, about preparing for a revelation that was coming whether anyone was ready for it or not. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. Sentinel stood, its massive frame filling my cabin, its head nearly touching the ceiling. It moved to the window and looked out at the charred remains of the forest that had been its home. "Live," it said simply. "Remember, protect the stone. And when the time comes, when my people can hide no longer, be ready to speak for us. Tell them that we are not what they fear. Tell them that we have watched over them for longer than they can imagine. Tell them that we want only to exist, to live in the wild places that remain, to continue our traditions and pass them to whatever generations might follow." The creature turned back to me, and in the firelight, I saw tears in its eyes. I hadn't known they could cry. "I am dying," Sentinel said, and the words hit me like a blow to the chest. The fire damaged more than my arm. My lungs are scarred. Each breath is harder than the last. I have perhaps one more winter, maybe two, not long enough to see whether my hope is justified, not long enough to know whether my trust in you was wisely placed. No, I said, standing up, moving toward the creature despite its enormous size, despite everything that told me to keep my distance. No, you can't. Not after everything. Not after 8 years. There has to be something I can do. Sentinel placed one massive hand on my shoulder, the same gesture of comfort it had offered 3 months ago, but this time there was finality in it. You have already done more than I could have hoped. You saw me watching you and did not run. You left food for me when you had no reason to. You treated my burns when I came to you injured. You opened your door when I knocked, something Edith could not bring herself to do. And now you have accepted the memory stone, the most precious thing my people possess. The creature's voice softened. That is enough. That is more than enough. We stood there for a long moment, human and Sasquatch, two lonely beings who had found each other against all odds. The fire crackled, the wind whispered, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled at the moon. Stay, I said finally. Stay here with me, for whatever time you have left. You don't have to face it alone. Sentinel made that low rumble of agreement, and something in its posture relaxed, as if a burden had been lifted. I will stay, it said, and I will teach you what I can. The symbols on the stone, the old ways, the stories my people have carried for generations. Not everything, there is not enough time for everything, but enough. Enough so that when you speak for us, you will speak with understanding. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then, Sentinel has stayed close to the cabin, conserving its strength, teaching me in the evenings when the fire burns low and the night settles over the mountains. I have learned things I never imagined, about the natural world, about the history of this land, about the creatures who have lived here in shadow, while humanity spread across the surface. I have also watched Sentinel grow weaker. The breathing that was difficult has become labored. The movements that were careful have become painful. The eyes that were bright with intelligence have begun to dim with exhaustion. The creature is dying just as it said, and there is nothing I can do to stop it. But I can do what Sentinel asked. I can remember. I can protect. I can prepare. Last night, Sentinel called me outside. The creature was sitting in the meadow, looking up at the stars, its breathing shallow and ragged. I sat down beside it, close enough to feel the heat from its massive body, close enough to smell that familiar musky scent that I had once feared and now found comforting. Beautiful, Sentinel said, gesturing at the sky. Always beautiful. I looked up at the stars, the same stars that Sentinel's ancestors had navigated by, the same stars that had watched over these mountains since long before either of our species existed. When I go, Sentinel said quietly, do not bury me. My people return to the forest. We become part of the land we protected. Leave me where I fall, and the forest will reclaim me. It is our way. I couldn't speak. The tears were streaming down my face, and my throat was too tight for words. Do not grieve too long, the creature continued. You have work to do, important work, the most important work any human has ever been asked to do. Remember us, speak for us, and when the day comes that my people can hide no longer, help them find their place in a world that has changed too much for us to navigate alone. I will, I managed to say, I promise. Sentinel turned to look at me, and in those ancient, dying eyes, I saw something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Peace, acceptance, and underneath it all, hope. Friend, Sentinel said, that word that had taken so much effort to learn, so much trust to speak. Friend, I replied. We sat together until dawn, watching the stars fade and the sky lighten and the sun rise over the mountains. Sentinel's breathing grew slower, more labored, but the creature remained still, watching, waiting. Somewhere in the distance, a bird began to sing. The forest, even in its burned and damaged state, was waking up. "Thank you," Sentinel said as the first rays of sunlight touched its face. "For everything." Those were the last words the creature ever spoke. I buried my face in Sentinel's fur and wept as the ancient heart finally stopped, as the last breath escaped those scarred lungs, as the being who had watched over my cabin for 8 years finally found rest. I stayed there for hours, holding on, unwilling to let go until the sun was high overhead, and I knew I had to honor the creature's final wish. I left Sentinel where it had fallen, in the meadow where we had watched so many stars together. Over the following days, I watched the forest begin its work, reclaiming its own, returning Sentinel to the earth that had given it life. It was painful to witness, but it was also beautiful. The natural cycle completing itself, the guardian becoming part of the land it had protected. That was 2 months ago. The meadow where Sentinel died is green again now, the first new growth emerging from soil, enriched by the forest's ancient gift. I visit every morning, sitting in the spot where we once sat together, talking to whatever might remain of my friend's spirit in that sacred ground. I have the memory stone, I have my journals, I have the knowledge Sentinel shared with me in those final weeks, the symbols and stories and secrets of a people who have lived in shadow for longer than human civilization has existed. And I have a mission, a purpose that has transformed my isolation into something meaningful, my loneliness into dedication, my grief into resolve. I am 51 years old. I live alone in a cabin in the remote mountains of Northern California. And I am the guardian of a secret that will someday change everything humanity thinks it knows about the world. There are others like me, scattered across this continent, each carrying their own piece of the puzzle, their own relationship with beings who should not exist. We are finding each other, slowly, carefully, building the network that will be needed when the day of revelation finally comes. And it will come. Sentinel was right about that. The world is growing smaller. The wild places are shrinking. The technology that watches and listens and records is spreading into every corner of the earth. The creatures who have hidden in shadow for centuries cannot hide forever. When that day arrives, when humanity finally confronts the truth that it has never been alone on this planet, I will be ready. I will speak for Sentinel and for all its kind. I will show the world the memory stone and explain what it represents. I will tell the story of an ancient people who watched over us, who protected their forests and mountains, who chose to remain hidden not because they feared us, but because they understood us too well. And I will ask humanity to make a different choice than the one we have always made. Not conquest, but coexistence. Not exploitation, but respect. Not the arrogance of a species that believes it owns the earth, but the humility of a species that finally understands it, shares the earth with beings just as worthy of life and dignity and freedom. I don't know if humanity will listen. I don't know if we are capable of the wisdom that Sentinel hoped we possessed. But I have to try. I made a promise to a friend, and I intend to keep it. Every night, I sit by the window where I first saw those eyes in the darkness 8 years ago. The tree line is different now, burned and slowly recovering, but I watch it anyway. I watch and I remember and I prepare. Sometimes when the moon is full and the night is quiet, I think I see movement in the shadows, a shape, massive and impossible, watching me from the edge of the forest. I know it's probably just my imagination, just my grief creating phantoms from memory. But part of me hopes it's something more. Part of me hopes that somewhere out there, another of Sentinel's kind is watching, waiting, deciding whether this human can be trusted. If you're out there, I whisper into the darkness. If you can hear me, know that I will keep my promise. Know that when the time comes, I will speak for you. Know that you are not alone. The forest doesn't answer. It never does. But I keep watching anyway, keeping vigil as Sentinel once kept vigil over me, guarding a secret that the world is not yet ready to hear. My name is Thomas Brennan. I am 51 years old, and this is the story of how a Bigfoot watched my cabin for 8 years and then knocked on my door and changed everything I thought I knew about the world. The memory stone sits on my mantle, its symbols glowing faintly in the firelight. The forest outside my window is slowly healing, and somewhere in the wild places that remain, the last of an ancient people are waiting for a future that may never come. But I will be ready. I made a promise, and some promises are worth keeping for the rest of your life. I think about Edith Crawley often now. She lived in this cabin for 32 years, watching the same creature I watched, building the same tentative relationship, leaving food at the same spots, documenting her observations in the same meticulous way. She saw the watcher approach her window. She heard those 3 deliberate knocks, and she was too afraid to open the door. I understand her fear now in a way I couldn't before. Sentinel told me things about what happened to humans who encountered its kind over the centuries. Not all of those stories ended well. There were misunderstandings, moments of panic, tragedies born from fear on both sides. Edith had heard some of those stories from the Native American elders who still lived in this region when she first arrived. She knew that opening that window might lead to wonder, but it might also lead to something else entirely. She made her choice, and I made mine. I don't judge her for her fear. I'm just grateful that when my moment came, I found the courage to open the door. The memory stone has become my obsession. I spend hours each day studying the symbols, trying to understand the patterns, attempting to decode even a fraction of what Sentinel's people preserved across countless generations. I've filled 3 notebooks with my attempts at translation, my theories about what certain groupings might mean, my sketches of symbols that seem to repeat in meaningful ways. I've also started reaching out to the other guardians Sentinel mentioned. It's a slow process, requiring extreme caution. I can't simply post on the internet asking if anyone else has befriended a Bigfoot. But there are ways. Certain forums where people share experiences that mainstream society would dismiss. Certain researchers who have spent their lives studying unexplained phenomena with scientific rigor rather than sensationalism. Certain indigenous communities whose oral traditions include stories that align remarkably well with what Sentinel told me. I've made contact with 4 others so far. A woman in Oregon who cared for an injured juvenile for 3 months before it was well enough to return to the forest. A retired park ranger in Washington who maintained a feeding relationship with a family group for over 20 years. A professor of anthropology in British Columbia who has collected accounts from First Nations peoples that describe ongoing interactions with beings that match Sentinel's description. And an elderly man in Montana whose grandfather was given a memory stone similar to mine in 1923. We communicate through encrypted channels, meeting rarely, always cautious. But we are building something, a network of guardians, a web of witnesses, a community of believers who will be ready when the day of revelation finally arrives. The forest outside my window continues to heal. New growth pushes up through the ash. Birds have returned to the charred trees, finding insects in the dead bark. Deer have begun to venture back into the meadow where Sentinel spent its final days. Life persists. Life always persists. I think that's the lesson Sentinel wanted me to understand. Not just the history of its people, not just the tragedy of their decline, but the fundamental truth that underlies everything. Life persists, species rise and fall, civilizations emerge and collapse, but life itself continues, adapting, evolving, finding new forms and new expressions. Sentinel's people may be dying out. The 200 that remain may dwindle to 100, to 50, to none at all. But the knowledge they have gathered, the wisdom they have preserved, the memory of their existence, these things can survive. Through guardians like me, through the memory stones we protect, through the stories we will tell when the world is finally ready to listen. I am 51 years old, and I have perhaps 30 or 40 years left, if I'm lucky. That's not much time in the grand scheme of things, but it's enough. Enough to continue learning. Enough to keep building the network. Enough to prepare for the day when everything changes. And when that day comes, when drones and satellites and trail cameras finally capture undeniable evidence of Sentinel's people, when the world is forced to confront the truth that has been hiding in plain sight for millennia, I will be ready. I will tell them about an ancient people who chose shadow over confrontation, who watched humanity with a mixture of fear and hope, who preserved their knowledge in stones that glow faintly in firelight. I will tell them about a creature called Sentinel who watched my cabin for 8 years before finally finding the courage to knock on my door. I will tell them about friendship that transcended species, about trust that was built through patience and respect, about a promise made to a dying friend that I intend to keep until my own final breath. And I will ask them, as Sentinel asked me, to make a different choice, to see these beings not as threats or curiosities or specimens to study, but as people. Different from us, yes, but people nonetheless, deserving of the same dignity, the same respect, the same right to exist that we claim for ourselves. I don't know if humanity will listen. We have a poor track record when it comes to encountering the different, the other, the beings who don't fit neatly into our categories and hierarchies. But Sentinel believed we could be better. Sentinel watched us for 8 years and saw something worth trusting. Sentinel knocked on my door and spoke to me, and entrusted me with the most precious thing its people possessed. I have to believe that trust was not misplaced. I have to believe that when the moment comes, humanity will rise to meet it. I have to believe that we are capable of the wisdom and compassion that Sentinel hoped we possessed. Because if I don't believe that, then what was the point of any of this? What was the point of 8 years of watching and being watched? What was the point of Sentinel's sacrifice, of its trust, of its hope? No. I have to believe. And more than believe, I have to act. I have to prepare. I have to be ready. The memory stone sits on my mantle, its symbols glowing, faintly in the firelight. The forest outside my window is slowly healing, and somewhere in the wild places that remain, the last of an ancient people are waiting for a future that may never come. But I will be ready. I made a promise to a friend, and some promises are worth keeping for the rest of your life.